All right, I would like to get us started. My name is Rashida Scar, and I am with Marin County Free Library. Marin County Free Library has partnered with SURJ Marin, and SURJ stands for Standing Up for Racial Justice. And this is a group that has organized around ensuring that equity takes place all over the Bay Area, but it's also a nationwide organization. And we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to welcome everybody to our third event in the Demystifying Affordable Housing series. And it's called Demystifying Affordable Housing Through a Racial Justice Lens. This event, we're discussing specifically the relationship between housing and school segregation. So I'm glad that you're here. We're happy that you've joined us. I wanted to introduce our panelists for today briefly, and then we'll start our program. Today on the call with us, we have Betty Hodges. She's the Executive Director of the Hannah Project, and she's going to be joining us to discuss her work with the Hannah Project and Freedom Schools. Juan Carlos Arauz, I'm sorry, I'm butchering your name, Juan Carlos, forgive me. He is the founder of E3 Educate. And we have J.C. Farr, who is the principal of Tamalpais High School here in Marin. And they will be joining us, sharing their expertise and bringing some more information about this really important topic. And from there, I think I'm going to hand it off to I should mention the SURJ members on the call with us today. Lisa Bennett is a member of SURJ, and she has been working with us throughout this program. We have Chelsea Supawit, who is helping us with tech, and she's also been a part of SURJ, and Barbara Kohler, who is with SURJ, and she is joining us and helping us with tech and doing some introductions as well. We're glad you're here, and we're ready to get started with a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Rashida. My name's Lisa Bennett. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with SURJ Marin. And what we do before large gatherings and special meetings is we do a land acknowledgement. And that is a way for us to recenter ourselves in the idea that we were not the first people here, and that we need to honor and recognize those who were. And sometimes I write land acknowledgements, but lately I've begun to find land acknowledgements that have been created by Indigenous people. And I would like to share with you in a 4.5 minute video, which does just that. So hold on for a second while I share my screen.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thanks. And I just want to make one more statement, which is that we are on land right now that was not ceded by the Coast Miwok people. And we want to acknowledge them, as well as you may have heard of the Indigenous Peoples Day 5, a group of local activists who toppled a statue of Junipero Serra and now face criminal charges because of it. And we are in support of the charges being dropped at SURJ Marin.
And we'll include a link on ways that you can support the Indigenous Peoples Day 5, as well as other organizations that we'll be mentioning throughout the time on video today. We would like to go ahead and get started soon with our videos, but first, Barbara, can you share a little bit about SURJ Marin and what you guys are doing?
Sure. SURJ Marin is it's the Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it's part of a national network of groups and people whose mission is to mobilize, organize, and educate white people, and to bring white people into the broader multiracial movement for racial justice. Is focused on dismantling systems of white supremacy here in Marin County. And we have accountability partners, APs, who are local Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations and community leaders to whom we hold ourselves accountable. And this year, our APs are the Marin City Arts and Culture, the Marin County Cooperation Team, and the Multicultural Center of Marin. And we do, we have workshops and we have book discussions, and there are lots of events that you can take part in that are available on our website. We have a newsletter you can subscribe to, and our address is surjmarin@.org. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Barbara. So we will, before the end of the program, we'll put all these links in the chats for you to check out at your leisure. With that, I think we're going to get started. We're watching two films today. The first is a frontline, the first half of a frontline program called Separate and Unequal. It came out in 2014, but as you can see, once you watch it, a lot of the issues are still the same. In fact, if anything, COVID has exacerbated so many of these inequities that we see. So we're going to be watching that. We're also going to be watching Desegregation Unification, which was actually a film that was produced by the Tam High School AIM group. And it's focusing on the current situation happening in Sausalito schools right now, as they're seeking to reintegrate Bayside MLK school. So you'll learn more about what's happening there from the students themselves, which is excellent. And I think you will enjoy. So Lisa, if you would share your screen, we'll get started with our films.
I will. And just to say, after the films, we will have a facilitated discussion with Rashida helping make that happen. So hold on, I will share my screen.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. So we're going to get started with the discussion portion of our program. So we're going to be reintroducing our panelists for the day, and then we'll get started with questions. At the end of this time, we will open it up for Q&A, and you'll be able to pop your questions into the chat, and we'll monitor those and start fielding those questions towards our panelists. Just as a side note, I'm putting two articles into the chat just so you can get a sense of what has been happening in Bayside and what is happening in the greater Bay Area. This is by no means a Marin problem or a St. George problem or a Baton Rouge problem. This is a nationwide problem, and we are seeing that play out in the Bay Area especially. So those are two articles there that you can check out. Right now, we're going to go ahead and Lisa, if you would come on and introduce two of our panelists, and Barbara's going to introduce one of our panelists as well, and we'll get started with questions. Thanks.
Sure, I'm happy to. I will start by introducing Betty Hodges. And I talked to Betty about how best to introduce her. And I think the best way to do this is to tell you why she's so important to me, so important to this event, so important to our community. Because to me, she embodies integrity, service, and empowerment. And to me, she has been just an icon in our community for educating and empowering scholars. And I have nothing but deep respect for Betty Hodges. So that's why she is here. Betty, would you like to say anything? You're muted, Betty. Betty, you have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the only thing that I would say to your last comment about community, I used to describe myself as a community economic development professional, but I'm striving to be a community education professional, trying to focus education inside of a community to create a culture of achievement.
I think next I will be introducing J.C. Farr, who I have come to know more recently, particularly in planning for this event. He is the principal at Tam High. And I would say equally, he represents integrity, empowerment of youth, and service. And he has been at Tam High for 6 years and has seen a lot, and I think exemplifies the best we can offer to our scholars in our community. JC?
Thank you for that warm introduction. I'm happy to be here on this panel this afternoon to speak to these issues. Thankful to the AIM students that produced that video that captures some of the challenge of education in Southern Marin. As the principal of Tamalpais High School, the students that graduated from the Sausalito Marin City School District feeds into TAM, and a lot of our work is really about helping them to elevate themselves and to address the gaps in the education that they had at the lower levels based on those segregation, based on that segregation. And so, we spent a lot of time really trying to help students socially adjust based on the fact that they have been segregated in those early years. And so I'm thankful to be here and lend my voice, my knowledge, my experience. This is my 24th year in education. I've worked all throughout the Bay Area, and I've seen all different angles of this conversation. And so I'm happy to participate.
Barbara, would you like to introduce our third panelist?
Yes, I would. And I am introducing Juan Carlos Arauz, who I have known for probably around 18 years. We met because we were both students in a martial arts studio. And I thought of Juan Carlos when we were talking about education and the impact on housing because of his work when I met him in the canal. He was a director for an educating an education program. And the goal was to get 100% of the students that were in the program to graduate high school. And he accomplished that goal with that program. And since then, he's gone on to do great things through the E3 program that's become international. And I just feel blessed and humbled to know him. And I'm excited for you all to get to meet him too. So is there anything you want to say, Juan Carlos?
Much appreciation to you, Barbara, for thinking of me as I've come to learn that this work requires relationships. And so thank you for seeing any wisdom that I can offer here today. And then the other piece I just want to offer to our panelists and to all the other folks is gracias a ellos que están aquí con nosotros, con quien yo tenía la oportunidad para educar. I just wanted to say thank you to all the students I was able to work with in our Canal community and had the opportunity to educate. And for all of us here, 2 words that maybe might stick with you all, I hope, is this concept called Ubuntu. It's an African word that says I am because we are. And then here, en la quech, Mayan saying that says a belief that you are my other me. So I hope we can hold on to that as we have this dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to start our discussion. So I just want to open it up, and I'm going to field this question to all of our panelists each in turn. Juan Carlos, I'm going to start with you. What led you to become an educator, and what have you learned during the course? I know, pick kind of the major lesson that you've learned in becoming an educator.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So you know, when I think about that question, I think what comes up to me is really sharing the story of why did I go into education. And I have to thank my my parents and my grandparents. They were born in Nicaragua. You know, they were not able to continue their education there due to a dictatorship. So my mother was sent here to the United States and my father was sent to Brazil. And so you might be wondering, how was I born then? Because, you know, they're in two different locations. But eventually my mother went to Brazil, and which is where I was born, in Brazil. And unfortunately, there was a military coup in Brazil, and they had some policies against immigrants there. And again, so my parents had to figure out where to go. So we went back to Nicaragua, and the dictatorship there had not improved. And so economically, there was no opportunity. And even though my father was able to get an education in Brazil, we moved here to the United States. And the phrase that my grandmother and mother said to me when they would send me to school is this phrase that they would share with me to say, you know, people can always take away things from you, like your land, like your house, and even move you around. But what they can never take away from you is what's in your mind. And that's an education. So, you know, for me, that's probably why I wanted to become an educator, having such a hard time in schools, wanting to see how I could shift that. And as a result, go into schools and do what I could out of that. And so I think the other question you mentioned around that is what have I learned about education? I mean, there's so much about this space. But as it relates to education, what I've learned, quite frankly, is this. We define in this country, which then has a huge influence around the world, that I've learned that education has been designed to keep the kind of oppression that exists in our society. And it starts with one simple question, and that is, who decides and who gets to be smart? And that very narrow definition of then the answer to that question has helped perpetuate this type of oppression that has divided people along class lines, racial lines, and so many other examples of diversity. And so what I've learned is all the work that we are trying to do to create awareness is powerful. But until we change the finish line of what it means to get an A and what it means to be smart and what it means to, you know, go off to higher ed, until that shifts, I think we're going to continue to struggle. And so the question that I want to leave with everyone today, in terms of what I've learned in education, is not, you know, who is smart, but how are you smart? And rather, an easier way of saying is, we're all brilliant. In which way are you brilliant? So I'll pause there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass that question on to Betty Hodges. Betty, can you share a little bit about how you got into education, and what are some of the lessons, or I would say like kind of the larger lessons that you've learned?
Well, first of all, I have Mississippi parents, and I grew up in the 60s. And I grew up at a time when in the Black community, education was the way out of oppression. And so education was instilled in my brain. So that's kind of one thing. The second thing is I went to school in the Sausalito Marin City School District and the TAM District. And in my whole elementary and secondary education, I only saw and had one Black teacher the whole time. And that was a profound experience for me, because when I first had that Black teacher and I was in her class, I somehow thought I was in a class of people who weren't smart because I had a Black teacher. And, you know, the teacher went home and told my mother that I was questioning her. And I learned a really important lesson. in that lesson about self-hatred that often comes with kids when they aren't able to see people like themselves in school spaces. So that's maybe a second thing that propelled me. And I guess the third thing was I didn't originally start out to be in a class. I have a California teaching credential. I'm a public librarian, as a matter of fact. I was a librarian, Portland, Oregon. So I have those kinds of threads in my background. But I entered this phase from the community space of trying to figure out how do you empower low-income communities. And that took me back to education. And so different than maybe JC and Juan Carlos, who I'm really happy to be in a discussion with. I know those guys in there, they have a lot to say. I'm glad to be in the conversation with them. But the thing that is probably different is that my focus is trying to figure out if the schools never desegregate, if things of all of these aspirations that we have for integration never occur, then how can we still have excellent education and have children who really care about education? And so that's kind of my perspective. That's where I'm coming from. And I guess in terms of lessons, I feel everything is teachable. So as a community development professional, we were charged with trying to teach people about how to redevelop a community. I was a part of that. And so education for me has a broader context than a school.
Thank you so much, Reddy. And I'm going to field this question one last time to JC Farr. JC, do you have any thoughts about why you became an educator and what is a major lesson learned as you're moving through your journey?
Sure. My biological mother passed when I was born, but my God-sent mother, Helen Felder, was a real community servant. And we were the house where, you know, free cheese and sandwiches were given out during the summertime. If any of you remember that kind of work. And she worked in an elementary school and really modeled for me what it meant to be a community servant. I have a spiritual background, and so going into education for me was really a ministry, because really what we are here doing is we're changing belief systems. You know, we're working to change the belief systems of the people that serve and of the kids themselves, so that they can see, you know, their greatest potential and believe in themselves. And so it's really a spiritual endeavor for me. What I've learned in my time in education is that we're living in a contrived reality. It's much like what Juan Carlos stated, where he talked about, you know, the winners and losers has been predetermined by the system, you know, by your zip code. And so some people talk about the failure of public education, and I talk about the success of it, because the system is creating the results that it is designed to create, which is to keep the caste system in place, people of color where they are. And so it's tough, you know, when I look at that video, and I know that I want to move on just a little bit to a different question. We looked at Baton Rouge, and we shouldn't have been surprised, because, you know, we're talking about the racist South. And then when we think about, you know, something happening closer to home in what is labeled a progressive, you know, county in Marin, to see some of the same things happening, you know, it's really, really, you know, disheartening. And people fail to acknowledge the realities of what, you know, the situation is. And it is a racist situation that we are addressing. And so calling it anything else other than, a spade, which we know that this is about structural inequalities and structural racism, because the one thing that was not acknowledged at all in any of those videos were how the wealth was obtained, and what, the impact of redlining and all of the policies that have been put in place to create the wealth gap that exists now in America over the hundreds of years that it has been in place. So now we look at 2022 and we see the wealth gap, and we see, schools that are high poverty and low poverty without really thinking about the historical context that has led us to being in the current situation. And so I just wanted to bring that to the forefront while I had the opportunity to just talk about, the local context of this, because it is really, really disappointing that we're in this situation in 2022 when we know that integration is best for our students.
Thank you. And I just want to give a plug for our previous two programs in this series, where we look very closely at some of those underlying achievement gaps and how they're connected to the wealth gap and how that wealth gap came to be. So everyone who registered for this program will get links to those other programs. So you can check out and get that background if you missed our previous two programs. Thank you so much, JC. I feel like that's a really, really important point. My next question, I'm going to field towards JC. I'm sorry, not JC, Juan Carlos. English language learners are actually quite incredible. They're able to communicate in more than one language, yet are often made to feel ashamed because they cannot communicate perfectly in English. How do we flip the dynamic so that all scholars are required to communicate in more than one language, and we can honor those students that have begun that process early?
Thank you. So I will answer that question in three parts. I'll answer the direct piece, which is, it's very simple. And that is, we look at our students currently as English language learners, which already creates a deficit mentality when actually we're all English language learners when we go through school. And when we bring in students from another who speak a different language, my wondering and goal would be, why are we not educating our students in a multilingual facet way so that all students benefit from this approach? But to JC's point here, that again, educational by design was that would create an inferiority complex for folks who are monolingual, and therefore, based on that fear, they said, I'm not going to do that, and we're going to go ahead and create that lower caste system. So that's the first part. That's the easy piece to do. The second part is we'll make it very local context here. And that is when we think of Marin County, which, by the way, has 19 school districts, and we look at Marin County, and you're looking at what happened in Baton Rouge and St. George and trying to create their own cities. Marin County got ahead of all of that because they've created their own cities. But let's start with San Rafael, which is actually one of the larger cities. And to this day, in 2022, we still have 2 segregated schools that are less than a mile apart from each other. Actually, it's 1.3 if you want to check the math. And that's Glenwood Elementary School and San Pedro School, where all the brown kids, the ones who speak Spanish, go to San Pedro in the neighborhood of Glenwood, and then all the kids who are not, quote, bilingual, are then sent to Glenwood. And it's all within the same district. And yet we have allowed that in this county for, again, the reasons that both Betty and JC said, which is being able to create a space here of saying, I want to do what's best for our kids. So I'm just getting warmed up here, Rashida, because I'm gonna start feeling some type of way. thank you so much for Betty and JC being on here, because it creates a level of comfort for me to be able to speak my truth. And that is the fact that, you know, Betty brought me one time to come speak when we were doing, I think it was a fundraiser for you, Betty, if you remember, at the Aqua Hotel for the Freedom School. And so what I learned is this, is that facts don't change people. We know this information and it doesn't change people. And maybe if people are truly willing to listen, that might occur. What I'll just share in the third part here is I just want to share a segment piece of a spoken word that I've created around language so that we can start to get to understand this space. And however you feel about it is however you feel about it. And that's the point. And it goes something like this. 790, how do you know where I can go if you don't know where I've been? It's just a number, but less than half of 1600. It's given so much weight, it only tells me that I'm not too late. Not that if I'm dumb or bright, just rather that I couldn't read or write. You see, you didn't ask if my mother was valedictorian because you didn't take time to learn the brilliance of my people because there was none of your historians. For all they knew was that I was not from here, but what I knew, what moved them was fear. So many tests to measure my predicting my possibilities, the SAT, GRE, MCAT, FCAT, and the Casey, but none of them asked for my history. In fact, all of them asked only in English, and to hide my identity, telling me I couldn't get a doctorate degree. So what kind of test measures if I can't go to college, but never ask about my father, but working here because he's working here as a hotel dishwasher? Now, what kind of test exists based on the foundations of eugenics? We know this. But instead of realizing this, there's multiple forms of intelligence. We still have educators. I'm not hating on you, JC, but we implement this. For overwhelming number of people who look like me failed, and they blame and perpetuate and stereotype my people to tell this tall tale. WTF, how was I supposed to know the synonym of cutlery was? Moving from house to house when I was a little kid, I had plastic spoons, forks, and knives because we had nothing but bugs running around alive. Now, I didn't have no table lined with silverware. We had bills spread out everywhere. We had no fine china glasses or plates because the palmetto bugs were flying around waiting after we ate. And how was I supposed to know the Pythagorean theorem was WTF? How am I supposed to know this Greek term just because? When you erased all of my Mayan Egyptian history, my past is a mixture of this racist, sexist, classist, violent tragedy. My lineage is the pillage of my indigenous community, the rape of my mother's mother, and the torture of my African's brother. And yet I still have Don Quixote's dreamer's dream of an illusion. And just because I don't know what a cupboard is the right pronunciation of cupboard, I know that I am bilingual, multilingual, because in English, there are more exceptions than the rules. You know, an I before E, except followed by a C. And Y is phonetic, not spelled phonetically. But, you know, in this language that is also conquested, called Espanol, you really see what you say. So go ahead and say and spell out trabajo, niño, libro, fuego, San Antonio, San Francisco. And because I don't speak English like cupboard is a cupboard, Arkansas will be Arkansas, and Chicago, it will be Chicago. Thank you, Rashida.
I want to encourage, yes, I would that deserves this. I want to encourage all of our speakers to go off. Feel free, because I think that's where we're going to hear really what the issues are. I think a lot of times these conversations are couched in very polite language, but I really want us to get a sense of really what the real struggle is, what the real fight is. So thank you so much for sharing that, Juan Carlos, and you hit on some supreme points, and thank you for that. And actually that leads me into a question for Betty Hodges. Betty, as we're talking about, you know, instructors and teachers for students, how do we ensure that we have culturally competent teachers? How do we provide resources, including housing, so that teachers of color can thrive in the communities where they're most needed, including bilingual teachers, including teachers that are able to kind of bring students up to who understand the struggle of dual language learning or multi-language learning, and who are able to meet students where they're at? How do we incorporate that?
Okay, so a couple of years ago, well, pre-COVID, I facilitated a discussion with superintendents from Sausalito, Marin City School District, Mill Valley School District, and I think Shoreline, around this whole issue of teachers of color and teacher of color pipeline. And it's complicated and difficult. And first of all, I believe that it's impossible for teachers to gain cultural competency while they're teaching. I think that the work of cultural competency has to be embedded in teacher training programs. I don't think that there's the time. I don't think that there is an environment once you're hired inside of school district. If you aren't comfortable teaching kids of color or being around bilingual kids, it's going to be problematic. Just this Friday, we were in a conversation about Black History Month, and one of the teachers from MLK School said to the coordinator of Black History Month, I don't feel comfortable teaching Black kids about Black history during Black History Month. And I know she's not alone. And whether it was Latino Heritage Month or whatever, so I think it's a huge problem in our, it's just a huge problem. That's the first thing that I'd say. Second thing that I would say, a lesson from the conversation with the superintendents was that for Marin, it's really hard to attract Black or teachers of color because teachers of color often don't want to be the only teacher of color. They don't want to be the token. There's not a mass. There's not a group. It's not a part of a culture of the school. And so that makes it a difficult proposition. In the case of Bayside MLK School District or Sausalito Marin City School District, the Hannah Project has two of our former employees that are teachers, but one teacher is at the elementary school and one is at the middle school. And so they have to carry the water for all of the cultural competence at the school, at either of their schools. So there's no synergy. So, and then I think the other thing that I would say, I know Juan Carlos is involved in a teacher of color pipeline. Bayside MLK has efforts that Dr. Garcia is doing around teacher of color pipeline. The Hannah Project ourselves have produced 8 teachers of color. But again, they're all over the Bay Area. And they're not, their presence isn't able to bring around the cultural change inside of the school district that you would want. And then I just want to maybe ask JC or Juan Carlos to amplify on that question.
Sure, I can just add one. You have to have a vision for an increase of representation. And so since, part of this discussion is about housing, I think one of the strategies is partnering with the municipalities to create affordable housing that could attract and offset the cost of living in this area. So that's, one. Then schools have to have programs and initiatives that, attract and draw people of color into them. So if you have programs such as AVID, if you have support systems like affinity groups, then that reduces the isolation that will keep people from wanting to come. And it will attract because people are drawn to the programs that make a difference in the lives of students of color. So offsetting the housing costs and being intentional about recruitment and retainment, right? Because we often talk about recruitment but we really don't talk about, well, what does it take to actually retain people in your system once you get them in? So it starts with the intention. It continues with the action plan that allows people to develop and grow so that they have opportunities to expand and develop their capacity and perhaps become administrators. So I think with it, taking all of those things together, you can create a pipeline that will then come into our schools. And with the understanding, I was reading an article the other day that talked about how both students of color and white students perform better when they have had at least one teacher of color in their education. So understanding that it is beneficial to all students to have that, to have teachers of color and being committed to it, I think would make a difference in our schools.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That when we're talking about this multifaceted thing as a librarian, you know, my mind goes towards, you know, books that have impacted me and helped shape my understanding of it. Brendan Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria is an excellent book, and it really does, you can extrapolate it out not just to scholars of color, young people of color, but it really is true for teachers of color as well. When you have that, when you have schools that are fraught with racial inequality, having teachers and instructors of color come into hostile situations where they are facing, kind of the wear and tear of trying to operate within a racist system, trying to make changes within a racist system. Having those affinity groups are so important. Having mentorship opportunities for these teachers is so important. And that isn't something that happens on accident. It's something that needs to be written into the product. It needs to be written into the plan for retaining teachers of color. So I want to amplify what you're saying there. Thank you. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race by Beverly Daniel Tatum. Excuse me, I said. So if you guys have a chance to check that out, thank you, Chelsea, for putting that in there. JC, I'm going to actually field this question to you. School boards are largely staffed by folks who have the time, money, and bandwidth to run for local school boards. These folks are also the people least affected by the decisions made due to some of the same privileges. What steps can we take to ensure that the decision-making bodies for our schools are made up by the people most affected by these decisions?
I mean, we have to have a concentrated effort in developing people that will take interest in participating on the school board. So again, I think I want to start with this concept of intentionality and ensuring that when you articulate the desire to have diversity, you must also accompany that with an action plan. And what I see most oftentimes in Marin County, we espouse the value of diversity, but then there's nothing behind it, right? There's nothing to actually support moving that agenda forward. And so I think that part of the strategy would be recruiting those in the community that have a stake to invite them into participating in these kinds of opportunities, such as being a member of a school board. Oftentimes, I also see that when people take on the role, they're often met with hostility, and then that can dissuade people from wanting to continue down that path. And so I think if we support, if we set the intention of having more representation, we follow up with an action plan, and then we support those that are in those positions, then I think that it will lead to an increase or more interest because that person is being supported. And similar to the teacher of color pipeline, it can't be, we cannot tokenize these positions and limit it to just one person. It must be that we bring other people along so that there's not that feeling of isolation.
Can I add to that question? Can I say something on that?
Please do, please do.
The other thing that I would say about that is about from a community organizing standpoint, it's also trying to build parent and community voice to be active and engaged with the school district. JC's last point, it can't be token. So we can't elect one Black school board member or one Latino school board member and expect them to carry all the water in changing the school. So there has to be an infrastructure, and part of that infrastructure is, making sure that you have trained community leadership that understands how schools work and can be pivotal at various points, and that you have a strong parent voice that is constantly putting pressure on existing school board members to address the issues that most affect their children. And the one thing that you'll notice in Marin County, there's very few organized, active parent voices in the schools that are people of color. And until we have that, we won't have effective school boards to champion the rights and the progressive change for students of color.
Thank you for amplifying that, Betty. And just to bring that even more to the forefront, we need to look at what are the barriers to people running for these. I mean, is it the people who are the hardest workers in our community are doing their work, so they are not able to take that time to run for office or to have that. So how can we, if we state this as a value for our community, how do we support that? How do we fund that? How do we make sure that the people who we most want to run and most want to see on our school boards have what they need in order to make that happen? So I just want to add that in there. Juan Carlos, I want to ask you this question because I feel like this really speaks to some of those issues. Healing racial trauma for our students, when we're talking about students that are facing discrimination, that are, living in a society where that does not love them, that does not care for them, that does not, that has decided that they deserve less, and while their peers that they can see deserve more. How do we heal our scholars in such a way that they are receiving what they need and that we are presenting them? How do we improve the environment into which we are sending them after we have given them that moment of healing?
Yes, yes. Well, that's such a great question that definitely I hope we're going to make sure we get a moment here to hear from Ms. Betty Hodges about the Freedom School, because
Absolutely.
That is what we need to do. And for those who are not familiar with the Freedom School, you're about to hear it. I think the first thing to offer in perspective of this is understand, first and foremost, I want to think of this as all of our children and all of our scholars. But when we think about specifically our BIPOC community, we got to continue to focus on having adults who look like our students in the classroom as the teachers. Right now, I'm going to offer some facts, but this is all on Marin Promise website here, Marin Promises Partnership website. But in 2015, when we started the Educator of Color pipeline, so this is 6 years ago, and it has not, it's starting to increase thanks to some of the work that we're doing. But here's the reality. You have literally only 58% of students as white students, nearly 30% are Black, Brown, or Indigenous, and yet only 6% are teachers of color who are Black and Brown. percentages don't mean a thing. Let's think of Marin County, 32,000 students. And what you had in that time is 4 indigenous teachers, 8 African-American teachers, 44 Asian teachers, 106 Latino teachers out of nearly 2,000 teachers. That is completely unacceptable. That's a stat that people need to keep thinking about. And the fact that there's only 8 African-American teachers just doesn't cut it in our community in California and in this country. Administrators, only 9% out of all the administrators are of color, are Black or brown. AKA we have our wonderful JC Farr. And we have 1 superintendent. Or no, now we got 2 because what's her name, went to Corte Madera, I think. So my point being is the numbers are too small. That's what we have to shift to even begin the process. And I think the second piece is, which I want to create space for Betty to answer, is students need to know who they are. This work about Sankofa, right? And I know Betty's going to talk about Sankofa. I have our Sankofa here award that I received a few years ago around understanding we got to know where we come from to know who we are so that we can fetch forward what's going to happen in front of us. And we don't spend enough time helping our students know who we are. And I'm not just talking about our Black or brown children. I'm talking about our white kids who don't know who they are. And so until we spend more time doing that, are we going to really get to this reckoning of racial healing? But I want to give more time to Betty because I love the Freedom School.
Thank you. And Betty, I would like to punt that your way. I also have another question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about the Freedom Schools and the work that you're doing there? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, Freedom Schools were come out of Mississippi Freedom Summer 1964. And they really were community development programs trying to make sure that the kind of plantation education that Blacks were receiving in Mississippi was reversed. And they started out about, as Juan Carlos indicated, about telling people who they were, their own history, and giving people a sense of agency. And they started out, it's not just education for kids, but education for parents. So fast forward in 2022, Freedom Schools are part of an effort that the Children's Defense Fund that was funded by Marion Wright Edelman started or reimagined around 2000, and there are probably maybe 400 or 500 Freedom Schools all over the country. Marin City has one. And so what Freedom Schools are all about is trying to let kids of color and low-income kids know that they can make a difference in themselves, their families, their communities, their country, and the world. They are culturally based, full day, summer, a 6-hour day program, primarily based on literacy. The people who teach in Freedom Schools are college students who are trained to know civil rights history and other movement history. The materials in Freedom School are all culturally responsive materials that pull from Black culture, Latino culture, various Asian cultures. Last year, we even had materials on Filipino culture, which was a whole new thing for us. They are focused, but they are integrated. So there's what happens with children, but parents too are very much a part of Freedom Schools. Every week we bring parents together, again, trying to teach them about political issues going on in their communities and trying to help give them the parents' voice. So it's a very holistic approach based on trying to help children know who they are. But the other ancillary benefit to Freedom Schools is that many of the people who are college students who are trained to facilitate learning in Freedom Schools end up becoming so excited about educating our children that they become teachers themselves. And so that's why I said we have, in our own little way, have created 8 teachers of color and 1 administrator over in Antioch, Pittsburgh schools. So it's a fabulous thing. My thing about healing, you talked about healing and putting people back into racism. When you're a person of color, you're in a continual process of healing, regenerating, reflecting, and then going back into action. It's a continual process. There's no such thing as kind of, at least in my lifetime, I've not seen anything that's permanent healing, because you're continually assaulted, whether it's voting rights, this fight, or whether it's children on a border, you're continually assaulted. And so in order to be viable as a person, and in order to keep going, you always are in a process of healing and regeneration, I believe.
But Betty, can I add on to that? Just
Yes.
when I think about healing, there has to be a recognition that harm has taken place in the first place. And I think, you know, since George Floyd, I think districts have finally started to acknowledge that they are institutionally racist. Without formal recognition, then, as you mentioned, then you are bringing kids right back into a space that hasn't acknowledged the harm that is causing to our students. And so I think, you know, when you're talking about school boards, just to kind of bring it back together, yeah, you have to have everyone in agreement that these are racist spaces, and you have to actively fight against racism. You have to take an anti-racist approach, and before you can move forward. And I think a lot of our schools hadn't done that until after George Floyd. It's like, what have you been looking at, you know, the past 200 years, where these results that we have seen have permeated, you know, throughout our schools. And so the formal acknowledgement of it was a good first step. Anti-racist plans are a good next step. And then the training to do restorative circles could further that work, right? But without, you know, a multi-pronged approach to creating these healing spaces, then you are correct. Then we do send kids right back in to be re-traumatized again from, you know, so I think there has to be, I'm a big planner, so I think there has to be that formal acknowledgement and a plan in place that allows for students to come back into spaces that are healing spaces.
And I also think, because just again, from the community standpoint, there's a huge amount of self-hatred in Black community. And so when I'm talking about healing, I am just so focused on the fact that our kids and even our families don't like themselves very much. And so the community also, the various communities of color also have to create not only spaces, but rituals, ways that people begin to acknowledge all of the hurt and trauma they are experiencing in the institutional spaces that we're discussing right now.
Thank you for bringing that, widening that scope a little bit and looking at the communities as a whole. And I just want to and that and say, we need to have those spaces inside of these institutions that have traditionally caused harm. So where are the healing spaces that we're creating within our school for our students of color? Where are the healing spaces within our libraries for our scholars of color? For our patrons of color, people who are coming in who have been traditionally locked out and abused and disrespected and left out of these conversations and spaces. How are we creating healing spaces within these institutions as we're trying to become more anti-racist and become spaces that are agents and changes for change towards good versus towards harm. And in that vein, I'm going to actually ask this of all three of our panelists. Black, Indigenous, Latina communities educating their own. Betty, I think I want to start with you on this. Is this more effective? I know we're talking about desegregation, but this is a very complex issue. And we've seen, especially in this case of the freedom schools, we've got a chance to educate students within their own groups, knowing that they're going to be going out into the world. Is desegregation a bad idea in some cases for students who are Black, Latina, Indigenous, Asian, who are coming in and experiencing racism? Betty, can I start with you with that?
Yeah, I started out by saying I came from Mississippi parents, and I said that for a reason, because not only because of the civil rights stuff in Mississippi and the freedom school stuff that came out of Mississippi, but because I was taught by my parents to really believe in my own ability to learn. We were taught that unless you were excellent, unless you were twice as good as a white person, you would never, ever get any credit for what you knew. And so freedom schools are all about trying to let kids know that, as as David Fernand said in one of the videos, of course you can learn. And as Juan Carlos said, and not only can you learn, but you're multi-talented. And so you have multiple ways of demonstrating your brilliance and your excellence. And what I love about Freedom School is that it gives kids that space, and they're free in a way that they aren't free in our regular public schools. This year, we had on their own, just out of their own kind of will and interest, students forming a kids of color affinity group inside of Freedom School. And the purpose was to help them be able to navigate better white spaces and deal with the subtle kinds of racism and biases they would encounter in school. I applauded, I was just blown away about that. But kids were saying, and these were kids from San Rafael, Latinx kids, et cetera, saying, look, I want these younger kids to know that when they get to San Rafael High, this is what they're going to encounter. And we want them to be prepared. So I believe, and I started to say this earlier, I believe that, yeah, there's certain things that can happen in the school systems that will make education more equitable, et cetera. But I really feel that communities of color owe it to themselves to educate their own in ways that cannot happen inside of schools as we know it right now.
You know, I have a highly nuanced answer to this question. I don't think it's a either or. I think it's a both and.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, schools like Betty's, the Freedom School, is just as important because it teaches about identity and self. And I think foundationally, in order to be successful navigating white spaces, one has to have a strong sense of self and self-confidence. And so I think that it is important that the opportunities that Betty, you know, affords our community, I just think that it's extremely important that we continue to support that. My answer is nuanced because, you know, working here in Marin County, just because you're my color doesn't make you my kind. It really depends on your mindset. You know, unfortunately, I've encountered some folks that have internalized oppression in this area, and it makes it complicated because it could be really, really hurtful to have a teacher of color who doesn't embrace a philosophy of liberation from oppression. And so I guess, you know, as I mentioned, my answer was nuanced because the answer is it depends on who is educating the kid, and do they embrace a philosophy of self-reliance, independence, knowledge of self. If they embrace those values, then the answer is yes. You know, it is a beneficial relationship. But if they are coming from a internalized oppression of white supremacy, which is all the way around us as we work in this county, then my answer would be no. So, you know, I trust Betty. You know, I trust Betty to do this work because I know where she's coming from. I know her past, and, you know, she talks about how she was educated, and therefore, yes, but that's not necessarily everyone that I encounter in this work. And that's a hurtful thing to say, right? It is a hurtful thing to say, but it's an honest assessment of where we are, you know, in this county. So I think it's a both and we have to be thoughtful about philosophy and the values that people have.
JC, I'm going to field that question to you as well. And just so you know, I know we're coming close to time here, but we would love to keep this conversation going just a few minutes more. If you need to leave, feel free to leave. Everyone who's registered for this program will get a copy of the video. I'm putting the resources that I mentioned previously into the chat. Feel free to cut and paste that so you can access information about these different organizations. But JC, I'm going to ask you the same question. We're going to keep it going here. So we're talking about, you know, having these spaces that are separate for Black, Indigenous, Latine children, Asian American children to learn more, to heal, to have that connection to their culture, and to have connection to other cultures that are not discussed in the public school. And in fact, there's a raging battle about discussing the history of race in this country, and the history of the cultures that have been, you know, downplayed for so many generations. I'm sorry, Juan Carlos, yeah. Not JC, sorry. Okay. But I would like to field that question to you. Is it possible that there's room or space for students of color to hear and to learn in these different organizations that, you know, are maybe separate from the public school system?
Yeah. Great question there. So, I mean, the way I would answer, I mean, yes is the absolute answer. Can that happen? And it is so important that it's a both and that JC's talking about. I think the piece is that, Audre Lorde, has this wonderful quote: "You can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools." So we cannot go around thinking that we're just going to be in racial affinity groups and assume that everything's going to be okay because of that. Because as JC said, skin don't mean kin, and we got to get past this thinking. It's really about what it means of who our people are, right? Who are our people? Now, the second part to the answer that I want to offer is like, who are we as a human beingness, right? Which is why I opened with Ubuntu and Lak'ech. But I want to offer like this piece that is so important is we have to get to the point where we're not having a parallel history test or a history lesson that is happening in this country, right? BIPOC community members are having one history lesson and current experiences, and then white folks are having a whole nother experience. So the problem is we got to realize, first and foremost, systemic oppression, which includes racism, sexism, all the other stupidisms, it perpetuates, because of the selfishness and greed of a few, the complicity and negligence of many, and the ignorance of most. We have been socialized to fear each other and focus on surviving instead of thriving. So now we live in this county where privilege, which is all of us trying to get to, right? We're trying to obtain as much privilege as possible because we just want to make sure things are easier for us. And we're ignoring how it's oppressing other people. And so we have to get to the point where we're willing to know who we are and then be willing to be in groups of different people to listen. But when you think about what listening is, it's almost the antithesis of privilege. And I'll give one quick example of that. Let's go to land, because I'm a big believer here that we talked about Marin County and the 19 school districts and the 19 St. Georges, basically, is what we have here in Marin County. And so I'm just going to throw out a number that a house was sold for $13 million here in Marin County. It just so happened to be Ross. Wealth, the way it's accumulated is through education and through passing it down from family. But when you look at the last 75 years of this house that was sold, then it's like, wow, who has that kind of money? Where did that get passed down to? You had the segregation of these 19 public school districts. You had the redlining that up to 1965, 1972, it was in the documents, do not sell the houses to Jews, Asians, Blacks, right? And so you also have, during that time, Brown board education. So where do people like me have an opportunity to buy and get $13 million, much less $1 million to buy a house? Oh, I got to go back to my legacy. So what was before that? Well, before that, from 1875 to 1950 is the Chinese Exclusion Act. Reconstruction ends, and now you have Jim Crow. Genocide continues. And in the West, it actually was getting really started here during that time. Oh, but that's when Ross was incorporated in 1908. And it wasn't incorporated, as the St. George fellows said, that they were like, I want to think about our community. No, they were incorporating because they wanted to make sure no one else would come in. And what happened before, why was Ross incorporated in 1908? Because John Ross, who bought the land from a land grant when Mexico became Mexico, had to die. He died, and his wife was not allowed to own land. So again, now we're talking about patriarchy and sexism. So she had to sell it, and that becomes Ross. So when you think about all these white settlers who come here, and we think about how the missions are established, I just want to highlight, like, the reason somebody has $13 million to buy a house is because of this legacy that's been passed on and passed on and passed on. Now, until we get to reckoning that whatever homes anyone on this call has, how are we thinking about like wealth, not wealth redistribution, but how are we thinking about wealth accumulation? How are we thinking about community housing? And how are we thinking about what I like to say is, today we have our tribes, Ross, San Anselmo, Fairfax. We have our tribes, and it thrives on commerce and it thrives on education, albeit segregated. Well, guess what? If we listen to our ancestors, and specifically our coastal Miwok, they also lived in tribes. They also had commerce, they also had education. The difference is that these Native American tribes and so many tribes across the country and across the world had a central value, and that was community. And in this country, what has been perpetuated has been individualism of greed and fear. So perhaps when we worry about how am I accumulating wealth, I'm not accumulating just for myself, but actually for all of us together. What would that look like to redistribute thinking our understanding of wealth, and then hence our schools would benefit much more by us interjecting with each other. Thank you.
That is amazing.
I know you gotta go. I know we gotta run and
no, keep going.
If anybody, we don't need to keep this conversation going, so feel free.
Here's the thing that I think kind of underscores, you know, your point is there's a missing component to this, is that corporations actually perform better when they have diversity.
Yes.
So, but that's an aside. So like, and white people don't see the loss of not being educated alongside people of color. It's almost like not thinking or knowing that we have something to offer, and not really paying attention to the fact that we are becoming a majority minority society. So if you go off into the business world, you are either developing a product to sell to people of color, or you're going to have to interact with people of color. So it's actually to your benefit to be in schools with people that don't look like you, so that you can converse with them and think about, you know, crossing those racial lines. So I think that's like a missing component in like the thought process when we think about segregation. There's a benefit, not just a beauty in education, but there's actually a financial benefit to learning how to interact with people. But, you know, I just wanted to kind of throw that point in there as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. We're going to keep it going. If people do need to hop off the call, we do understand, but we will be recording this and emailing this out. There's a couple of more questions I want to get to before we briefly hit some Q&As. We do have a couple of questions from folks. What would the ideal learning environment look like for our scholars of every ethnicity? And how, this came up in the chat a little bit, how do we educate white scholars to identify, name, and dismantle the systems that benefit them to the detriment of others? Betty, I think I'm going to throw this out to you first.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, I know. Under the bus.
I am under the bus. Well, my first thought, I mean, to your last point, was just tell them the truth. I mean, tell them the facts of our history. Tell them the facts of the world. Just tell them the truth. Stop sweeping all this stuff under the rug, you know, about the ugly little secrets about America and America's history. I mean, so, you know, that's kind of my, you know, my big thing in terms of, no, I just want to say that.
The other question I had was, what would the ideal learning environment look like for our scholars? In addition to that, and I'll field this question out to the other participants as well.
Look, I'll jump in to give Betty a little opportunity to think about it, but one that affirms the identity of all of the students that we have. And so we have a rich history of accomplishment, all of us. And so if we teach in ways that we value diversity and we celebrate the accomplishments of all the students, and we teach a balanced curriculum that brings forth the contributions that everyone have made to the society that we have, both good and bad, I think that's an environment that affirms the identity and the contributions. And it goes back to what Juan Carlos said, that everyone's smart and brilliant. and has something valuable that they bring into the space. So I would want an environment that celebrates that values that makes sure that it acknowledges those contributions and celebrates those contributions.
Thank you so much.
And I would,
yes, go ahead.
and I would want a space where people have multiple ways to show who they are, their talents, and what they've learned. You know, other than some kind of grading system, you know, ways that people can do portfolios, ways that people can show what they've learned through dance, art, music. I think that the way we evaluate achievement needs to be opened in a way that coincides with the way that JC is talking about celebrating who people are. We need to be able to celebrate how their ways of expressing who they are and what they've learned.
Decolonizing.
And I'll add a 30-second here consideration for all of us. And that is, we have had an opportunity and continue to miss it in this global trifecta pandemic of health, climate, and social unrest. And that is, regurgitation of content is not enough. Like, I know we need to learn how to read and write, but what JC was saying earlier about people, how to get along with each other, you know, that is all skill-based, which only can be learned through experience. So I'm going to name 5 things that we can go home and do right now, which is 5 skills that we can get better at: being innovative, being adaptable, being a better critical thinker, being a better cross-cultural communicator, and being a better collaborator. And you only get better at doing that through experience, and you only even get better at that if you actually have diverse experiences. So the more we practice and measure that, then we can go ahead and get into a space where you say, Rashida, everyone benefits and feels like, oh my goodness, I am brilliant. So I'll make a shameless plug. Go to the e3educate.org website and take your free survey, but more importantly, it's for the students to be able to see how darn brilliant they are. We have ways to do this.
That is a mic drop moment, I feel. I think that's a wonderful place for us to kind of end the formal part of our program, and then we're going to open it up to Q&As a little bit here. Lisa, have you been monitoring the chat? Can you read a little bit of some of the I am going to put the resources that I put in earlier again. The E3 Educate website is in that list, so I will I'm gonna add that in again. But Lisa, Barbara, Chelsea, if you guys want to throw in any questions that have come in into the
just
chat.
shared with you, Rashida, a question that we did get from the audience prior.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling while I'm reading. Can you put it in one more time? Thank you. My goodness. Sorry, I'm having issues with my chat here. Great to hear JC, Farr, and everyone else. I hope at some point we can address how the Tam High swimming pool became racially segregated de facto. Oh, excuse me. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm having issues with my chat.
I can read it if you were having
please do.
issues.
Thank
Sure.
you.
So JC, this is directed to you. Let's discuss how the Tam High swimming pool became racially segregated, de facto, banned Black children from 5 decades of more equal access through privatized white swim teams monopolizing the access. This is not on you, JC. It's a decision that was made prior to your working in the district, but just a question about, you know, have you had to look into that? Have you experienced that? Are you aware of this? What are your thoughts on this?
So I've heard of it before, and I will say that the privatization of the swim teams aren't a TAM high. You know, it's not a function of TAM high. Our physical education classes are integrated. The kids do have a swim unit, and therefore they do have access. We have worked with Play Marin to discuss ways of getting kids into the water. I've even met with the Marin Rowing Association about ways to turn kids on to rowing as ways to get them in the water. So from my standpoint, from my position, you know, I've tried to use my sphere of influence to you know, impact that in a positive way. So there isn't a policy per se, but I do think of choice is one of the things that we're trying to address by getting kids interested in swimming at an earlier age, right? I think that is the route that I would want to go, so that they feel confidence in that skill, and then can join a swim team or join a diving team, which they also have access to.
Thank you for responding to that. We have a question about, can any of our panelists speak to the Miller Creek School District and things that are happening there, or if that's outside of your jurisdictions or expertise, that's completely fine. But that was one of the questions that was put into chat.
I don't work directly with Miller Creek.
Okay. So that might be an avenue of research for folks if they want to look into the situations that are happening there. John, do you have any follow-up questions about that? And as we're waiting, are there any other questions that anyone has for our panelists right now? We would be happy to field those, and then if not, we'll close out our time for the afternoon.
I have a closing comment. I don't, you know, I'll just jump out there and say it. The solutions are there. You know, we are in one of the most affluent counties in the country, and therefore the world. We are in one of the most educated counties in the country, and therefore the world. And so I work with, you know, many smart people who have the knowledge base, you know, to utilize and implement the plans and strategies that can positively impact, you know, outcomes for students of color. I think the question becomes, do we have the will? Do we have the will to do what it takes? Do we have the will to sit through the discomfort? Do we have the will to allow things to get messy in order for them to be better? There are going to be pain points along the way, but I feel that it's important, you know, for the lives of our youth, that we push through that discomfort, and that we start to develop the will to implement the strategies that we know can be effective for our students. And so I think, you know, as my concluding statements, I just want to encourage everyone who's been on this call today to commit themselves to doing something tomorrow that will help move the agenda forward. And if that means having an uncomfortable conversation with someone that you know that has a sphere of influence, to do so. Our kids are uncomfortable in classes. They are sitting isolated in classes. So as adults, we should be able to experience some of that by having some of these challenging conversations.
Absolutely.
So I just want to encourage everyone to do so. for the sake of our kids now and for their futures. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And just a clarification, as we're talking about, you know, the Indigenous Peoples Day 5, John's question about Miller Creek School District, it was called Dixie School District. We just changed several school names from Drake High to now it's Archie Williams. You know, we have these things built in structurally built into our communities, where communities of color that have faced harm, they're attending schools named after the people who have harmed them. We're attending schools that are, you know, proclaiming a racist, segregationist, you know, ideal. As adults, and I love that you're bringing this in, that we're talking about, we are the adults in the room. You know, we are the ones who are supposed to be setting, creating the atmosphere for our scholars to learn in. Is it going to be a positive one, or is it going to be one where they're constantly battling, feeling oppressed? So that's why I thank you for highlighting that. And, you know, if anybody wants to speak on some of the ways that we're changing things around to make environments more comfortable for our students, please speak to that if anyone feels inclined.
I don't know if you were asking the panelists here.
Panelists, yes.
Oh, okay. So
any of the panelists.
Here's one thing I just want to make sure I share here as you ask that question that I think would be really helpful is, first and foremost, you know, I moved here from Florida to California 20 some years ago. And somehow in these 20 years, I have found myself working with JC Farr, working with Betty Hodges, working with Barbara, working with YLI has a great youth leaders, you know, commission, working with West Marin. I mean, the Multicultural Wellness Center. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. I encourage to double state what JC Farr said. Commit and do something. Not saying that you're not doing enough, figure out your capacity and all that. But Sonia Renee Taylor says it best. We are not going back to normal. Normal never worked out for any of us. That's why we're in the global trifecta pandemic. So let's continue to figure out a way to learn all the wonderful things that are happening already in Marin County and continue to connect as best as possible and fit in where you can get in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of more questions, but I think we do need to honor the time of our speakers and end here. We appreciate each and every person for participating in this. All of this video will be emailed out. I would be happy to email our speakers with the questions of the people who didn't get a chance to put their questions out there. And hopefully we can have answers for you on those questions specifically. But we appreciate everyone for joining us. And we hope you have a great afternoon as we continue on, and we will be continuing the series. So you should be getting an email from me at the beginning of next week with more information about how you can find that moment where you can give back, whether that's having a hard conversation, whether that is educating yourself on these issues more deeply, whether that is, you know, engaging civically to make change. We will have resources for you to help you be able to ramp up and to start that process. For our speakers, please stay on just for a moment after this so that we have a chance to touch base. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to stop the recording. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.